Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here. I couldn't hesitate this invitation, so pardon my English. I'm not a native speaker. I don't work in English. It's second language, and I use it occasionally. But it's hard to believe in these times one needs to fly like 10 hours to feel almost like at home. Apart from the language and some architectural details. I never felt this like this before in the United States. Because I mean Democrats in different places of the world, but especially in your country, in my country, we are, say, brothers in troubles, as we've never been in my lifetime. What most of you Americans know about current situation in Poland. You obviously know that we got crazy. And in general terms, it's right, unfortunately. But forgive me, please, frankly speaking, it's almost the same we in Poland know about you here in the US. So you know we get crazy and we know you get crazy. You have elected Donald Trump and we have elected Andrzej Duda. It's not the same, but in my opinion, it represents the same problem. Both of us also know very well that people in some other countries get crazy too, like Italians who elected Berlusconi and they did it again. Like in France, people almost elected Madame Le Pen, British voters voted for Brexit, and Germans, those most predictable and boring political community in the post-war Europe, they were unable to create a new government for months. In democratic narrative, it's usually described as populists ante portas situation. They have won some Western states. In other states, they are growing and complicating political business as usual. It seems to be alarming, it seems to be epidemic, but WHO is silent because it's not a medical case. It's strictly political case. And it's not about the major ideas of the West, in my opinion. Particularly, it's not about the very idea of democracy, market economy, and freedom. Vast majority still believe in the basic set of liberal ideas, as it used to. So, so-called populists claim they represent the same values. They claim to be real democrats, real patriots, real market-oriented economists, and real freedom fighters, at least in Poland. Populists claim they are real representation of values all the elites only talk about. They do it because liberal values are still valuable for Western societies, including Americans, Poles, and so on. So, what is this crisis about? In my opinion, it's about institutions and people. Perhaps to some extent, it's also about advanced tools of social manipulation like Cambridge Analytica's technology of big-scale political profiling and micro-targeting, but this is a proof, not an alternative explanation, in my opinion. To make a long story short, it seems to me that institutions are generally okay, at least as it has always been. And people are generally okay as always. The problem is that they no more fit each other. That is why people, and in Poland we feel it very deeply. That is why people feel they lost control over institutions, and many of us feel institutions lost control over reality, including people, of course. Contemporary people and institutions are from different historical periods. Democratic institutions we use are from the 19th century. People around us are from the 21st century. Almost everything around belongs to the 21st century, with an exception for parliaments, political parties, or elections. And what could add to this list school and the 20th century media as tools of socialization? Why is it so crucial now and was not 20 years ago? Because in this time, a peaceful revolution happened as a result of digitalization and globalization. These two factors changed everything and everybody, including me and all of you, internally. The famous future shock is here. Alvin Toffler was right, of course, and even more than he could expect. Technology changed us and everything around us. Our families are different, our kids are different, our relations with others are different, societies are different, states are different, economy is different, production, distribution, media are different as well, distribution of knowledge and skills is different, position of experts, including universities, is much different. And yes, global and social balance or imbalance of power is different as well. These changes create huge opportunities and progress in many fields. But for political order, the most important factor is they create instability. We are happy with each new Tesla car or iPhone, but we are alarmed with instability, uncertainty, loneliness in front of privatization of non-understandable risks. This everybody knows and many of us feel. The popular belief is that no hopes and dreams, as in earlier decades, but fears became the major political drive. In Poland, it's easy to see. And of course, it's socially unacceptable in longer terms. Nobody likes to live with constant fear. And if you look at Polish revolution, this is a revolution of fears, not of expectations, not of needs, not of inequality, just of fears. It creates unsustainable political order because citizens are looking for anybody who will promise to reduce fears. We know it from history, and very little has come from this knowledge yet. More and more people request change to reduce those fears, and populists offer solutions or illusions of solutions, while liberal democratic elites of the status quo offer mostly awareness of necessity, or rather illusion of necessity. The political competition in Poland is between populistic illusion of reducing fears solutions and liberal democratic illusions of necessity of these fears. So it's easy to guess who is supposed to win. Leaders of status quo political parties say, "We will show you how to deal with your fears," while so-called populists say, "We will liberate you from your fears." This is like religion, liberation from fears. Status quo says, you must change yourself and your life to fit to the new world. And new populists say, the world must change to fit to you. Status quo requests us to change. Populists request the world to change. In Poland as well as in many other countries, liberal democracy get into this trap. Bronisław Komorowski, who lost his second presidential term to current President Andrzej Duda, famously said, "You must change your job and take a mortgage when, during presidential campaign, a young man asked him how should he live, earning not enough to rent an apartment. And Duda's staff answer was, "We will provide assistance." That is the essence of populistic challenge. But isn't it also an expression of brotherhood, part of the fundament of democratic ideas? Of course, populists are unable to deliver everything they promise. Even majority of PiS constituency knows that it's impossible. But PiS delivers something more important now, after years of growing, humiliating fears. They deliver recognition, attention, concern. In place of "yes, we can," they put "yes, we care." That's the substantial change. Constituency of PiS is ready to forgive Kaczynski his mistakes, at least to some point, which is today perhaps, because it believes he is at least trying to provide relief, while liberal Democrats don't even try. Liberals are saying, "We create progress, and it will make your life better." And yes, it's better, at least in some dimensions, and at least for part of the society. But it doesn't reduce fears, because you are still afraid that you will lose what you got. PiS demonstrates there are good reasons for fears, and they will reduce it, while Democrats demonstrate fears come from weakness of everybody in front of inevitability of the reality. We know these fears and its possible political outcome for at least a decade, from 2008. But the fact is, we are unable to address it with proper policies. Even if we suppose we know what policies would answer to these fears properly, existing political institutions are unable to implement these policies. Tobin tax is a good example, but there are hundreds of other cases. Thank you. Generally, liberal democracy is still delivering good things, like freedoms and some economic growth. But in the last 2 decades, it has been delivering less and less feeling of security, safety, and optimism. These 3 more missing factors together with new means of communication created a demand for new political hope, vision, and promise. Populists deliver it. Democrats do not. Here we come to my major message. Populism is not the problem. It's only a symptom of our fundamental problem. Populists just do their job. The real problem you have is with us, with liberal Democrats and with liberal democracy. If you want to preserve liberal democracy, free market, and freedoms, Democrats must change and we must reshape democracy. In Poland, this is clear. When populists try to change reality, Democrats try to preserve it. For many people, it looks like populists try to regain security and safety for Poles, and Democrats try to regain previous insecure and for many unsafe order in which old elites were advantaged. The problem is, among Polish Democrats, There are many ideas and debates concerning punishment for populists when they will already be out of power. There are some dreams about restoration of liberal democratic order, but there are very few ideas and debates about new sustainable social and political order we will build if we are in power again. In very short, populists in Poland, but not only there, try to build different world. Democrats are all the time defending the old one. That is not only because of what Thomas Kuhn described as defense of paradigm. Yes, old elite is defending old paradigm in which its members were educated and recognized. This is natural that old elites defend their achievements and legitimacy. But defensive position of Democrats comes also from a long time experience, like 20 years or something like that, which teaches us that within the contemporary democratic order, it's impossible or extremely difficult to deliver substantial change, if you want it. More social security, impossible. More equality, impossible. More safety, hardly possible, even at the expense of many freedoms. Even after 2008, very few things could be changed. Elites of status quo defended it so effectively that even tax havens are as safe as it were. Well, perhaps it seems to be a bit exotic for you that Poles care about tax havens. But they do, yes. It's a very popular subject in the country. And big social pressure on the government to do something with that. Very difficult. The message I would like to mark with bold is autocratic populists grow because liberal democracy lost ability to change itself and to accommodate to the changing environment in which it's existing and which creates unacceptable social stress. Of course, saying unacceptable, I must mark that it's not objective, it's subjective, but politics is subjective all the time. I mean, I'm not that Marxist to say this is determined. It's about what people feel. This inability is due to the fact that mechanisms of the entire human equilibrium changed substantially last 2 decades, with an exception for political structures. Our old political institutions are being crushed by new powers. You may call it revolution or counter-revolution, doesn't matter. People are more and more alarmed with the direction many things change, but liberal democracy is not able to offer an answer. Somebody has to fill up the vacuum, and so-called populists do. I say so-called populists because it's not the truth, they are only wrong. Populists underestimate obstacles when Democrats underestimate possibilities. Sometimes they are uninformed or so, and sometimes we are misinformed. In Poland, they were uninformed about, for example, complicity of Polish-Jewish relations and about importance of free speech in democracy. When we were misinformed by mainstream economists about the possible economic and social outcome of famous 500 zlotys government checks for every second child. So, partly, everybody is wrong. They underestimate one problem they created, and we overestimate another problem they created. They stay popular because they gain enough due to our mistakes to pay for their own mistakes. I'm not saying things are better or worse for liberal democracy now. They are just substantially different. So if Democrats want to achieve more or less the same, freedom, security, just society, we are supposed to do it another way. But in countries like Poland, it's not possible within current system of political institutions. Why? Because liberal democratic institutions are no more sensitive enough to popular needs and requests. They turned from democratic to meritocratic and created so-called regulatory capitalism. In Poland, it's extremely regulatory. The political power of regulators is untouchable, in fact. We trust too much in the soft power of liberal ideas and knowledge, and we trust too much in hard powers of rule of law. So we underestimate the crucial importance of demos in democracy. Generally, there was vote and shut up policy for years. We felt secure behind these two walls, and we haven't recognized that we lose social roots. We in Poland even developed pervasive idea of fantastic, tough and unpopular reforms, and of great governments losing power because they did what they intended to do, not what society likes. It's hard to imagine for me how democracy may survive if Democrats believe they may constantly do things that vast and growing part of society doesn't like. And how liberal democracy may exist if it doesn't supply more or less what majority demands. It's not a case for populism. I don't want to say liberal Democrats should do only what majority likes. But we shouldn't all the times do things majority doesn't like if we are Democrats. Apart outputs we expect. That means that we should wait with important changes as long as we gain popular support for it, with an exception for some emergency problems, of course. But Polish liberal democratic elite chosen different ways. One was, we know, you follow. That was legitimate on the very beginning of the transformation, but became permanent part of political culture. The other was, have a fun and don't disturb, or shut up. Both of it determined, for example, policy towards public media, which are part of European political system. After 1989, state-owned TV and partly radio stations were commercialized and dedicated to entertainment, not to guiding society through difficult, tough, complicated, absolutely new experience of transition. Similarly, school was by governments considered as workforce supplier, not as place where democratic society grows. These two important institutions dedicated itself to viewers and employees rather than to participants and citizens. In 1989, Poles knew nothing about democratic capitalism, rule of law, and so on. Before 1989, there were some programs helping elites to understand how this system works, but very little has been done after to transfer this knowledge to society. On the end of the day, and I think now is the end of this day of Polish democracy, vast majority still has not been familiar with the idea of the rule of law or free speech. Even in parliamentary group of Civic Platform, the main party of democratic opposition, the first decision was to vote for the famous anti-defamation laws contested by the US, Israel, and many other countries. This law has been contested because it established punishment up to 3 years in prison for any person wherever on the earth, claiming that Polish nation or state is in part responsible for the Holocaust. Even for a young generation of Polish liberal Democrats, trying to defend political freedoms in front of authoritarian populists, it is still not obvious that jail for words is not a very liberal democratic idea. How could it happen? Among many factors, I would stress more and more painful deficit of active citizens. When political representation is not well rooted in local level, on a local level, then it degenerates because it's not under pressure to explain, represent, lead, understand, and so on. Polish politicians are not well rooted because political soil is tiny. It's not popular to organize, participate, support, and run for elected offices. On a daily basis, society is silent and remote from politics, much more than Western societies. That means politicians are not controlled, stimulated, and properly chosen. Most of them are not local leaders, activists or so on. Often they become members of parliament or even cabinet ministers by coincidence. So we have built democracy without democrats, without citizens ready to act for public good, and without representation willing to represent anything more than itself and its own interest. Of course, there's always been a group of good citizens and politicians, but they were way too few to determine quality of the system. The Polish political custom is we are silent for a long time, and then we unexpectedly explode. Professor Eckert mentioned some explosions before. Not all of us, but substantial number. It's very difficult to predict when and why it happens. It doesn't last long. Majority soon withdraw back home. And a little group is trying to build something permanent. This problem we inherited from our past. But we also imported some universal problems with citizens and representation from the West. Robert Putnam named it bowling alone society. Now we could name it smartphone society. With these machines, we are different creatures, so we create different society. And other machines create different economies. This universal factor fits perfectly to Polish tradition and radicalized it as it could. Less citizens, less representation, more activists, and more political explosions. This is the situation I see now. Explosions are important to stop bad things, and they manage, but are not useful to push anything forward, to create decision-making process, or even to push things in proper direction. I don't want to go into details of this revolution because we don't have enough time. Just let me, in this context, remind the times of Industrial Revolution. The scale of change is comparable in many dimensions. So we should expect similar challenges to social, economic, and political order. As everybody knows, Industrial Revolution was followed by waves of unrest, revolutions, and wars. We probably are more civilized now, I hope so, But if political and social order of liberal democracy is unable to accommodate to the ongoing digital revolution, we will probably not survive, and bad things may happen as well, nationally and internationally. Some of bad things already are happening. The wave of populism is the beginning, I believe. I hope it will not go too far. It happens everywhere, but some places are touched more. One of them is Poland. Why? As you know, generations of Poles were fighting and praying for freedom. Not only for independence of Poland, but also for personal freedoms. Freedom of expression, of press, of traveling, of business, associations, as well as independent course. Historical window of opportunity opened in '89, and we used it to move from east to west. The Western liberal democracy was on its peak then. The euphoric decade was just beginning. Francis Fukuyama was already writing his famous essay, The End of History, with misunderstood conclusion that liberal democracy achieved its destiny, and it may not be better, it may only be worse. In 1992, when The End of History has been published, Ralph Dahrendorf, famous Ralph Dahrendorf, came to Poland and gave a lecture in Polish Academy of Science. Written transcript of the lecture doesn't exist. But what he said, and repeated in an interview he gave to me, was that we joined the West too late. Because the great time of liberal democracy is over, welfare state is over, good times are over, European model is generally over and decreasing. Generally, Asiatic values will prevail with Asian model of society, economy, and Singapore-like or China-like political order. Shortly, his prediction was, we will now slide back to the order in many ways similar to this we've escaped from. Perhaps he was right. I hope not. We were waiting for freedom too long to believe that this is determined we will lose our freedom soon again. We, I mean Polish liberal democratic elites, believed that after 2 centuries long dreaming about freedom, we will keep it and love it and defend it forever, even though the West has some problems with democracy and freedom. Now we know it was an illusion. But until 2015, when populists gained power in Poland, it was popular belief. The West has some problems with democracy. They have some problems with freedoms. They are tired, they are lazy, but we are real Democrats. We will defend our democracy, we will believe in freedom, and Poles will give, what we'll give to the world? Our values, democratic values, freedom values. And what happened? Now we know it's possible that we will destroy Polish democracy and freedom with Polish hands. First time. We know authoritarian populists may stay in Poland for a while. And we know that even if they will lose one day, they may come back. Peace was already in power for like 10 years ago. If reasons they appeared will not disappear, because there were some reasons. They haven't come from Mars. Now I will answer to the question from the title. Can liberal democracy be saved? And my answer is no. I don't think it can be saved. At least in country I know the best, I mean Poland, liberal democracy may not be saved and may not be restored. I'm very sorry saying this, but in politics, illusions are worse than tough truth. Idea of saving Ancien regime order seems to me to be a deadly illusion. But I believe liberal democracy may be reinvented in a way in which it will fit to digital revolution society in general and to the, say, traditional low density and low trust society like in Poland. I believe this is possible. What should be, in my opinion, done if we really want to have liberal democracy means freedom in a country like Poland, and if we already know, I think what I said before and many other things. Well, I see 3 points. First, we need to stop dreaming about restoration. Stop defend what populists are destroying. We must be critical our way, not apologetically, towards the past. To restore Ancien regime means to restore all reasons why populists won. If we restore liberal democracy as it was, we'll also restore the wave of populism that destroyed liberal democracy. It comes together. Perhaps even worse. It's difficult because of instinct of self-defense described by Thomas Kuhn, but we have to overcome it, or we lose. Second, we need to invent political idea of liberation from excessive fears to provide new optimism and positive energy for liberal democratic movement. In Poland, liberal democrat sounds boring now. Liberal democracy sounds boring now. Liberal Democrats as well. Liberal Democrats need a new dream to share, perhaps with a new name, new leaders, new language, new organization, new ideas, able to mobilize citizens for political action. Now we can only mobilize people to protest against some extremely excessive acts of the government. Of course, after Occupy movement, we know how difficult it is to build something new. But if populists are as bad as we consider they are, then awful world they create will mobilize people and, what perhaps is even more important, will force current liberal elites to open itself to new ideas. If proper positive idea, our new liberal democratic dream, is there in the right time when populists will collapse, then it will win. If it will not be there, then one authoritarian populism may be succeeded with another one authoritarian populism, perhaps even worse. There is a competition of authoritarian populisms in many countries. Mention Hungary, but look at Poland as well. 3, we need to invent political institutions able to combine leadership, representation, and rational political choices. Current institutions, parliaments, parties, elections, are unable to deliver all these needs, or they deliver much, not enough. The wave of populism shows that we need more democratic democracy and more meritocratic administration. People request direct influence. They don't trust politicians. They less and less trust democratic government. And they are right. But it's not the end of liberal democracy, because we know democratic innovations, like deliberative panels, like popular internet polls, and so on. Politologists write books about it. It's practiced in some Polish cities with very good effect, but not on national level. That led to separate democratic control and democratic representation from meritocratic decision-making and decision-taking process to make it not so heavily influenced by lobbying, corruption, the party dependency, and different hidden pressures. We need this institutional project as part of our new big liberal democratic dream to make it trustworthy. I'm very close to the end. That's not a fairy tale. Like 3 years ago, I had a honor to coordinate a group of leading academics and intellectuals who, in interdisciplinary effort, prepared this kind of a project. The group included President of Polish Economists Association, Elżbieta Mączyńska, ex-Minister of Finance and Foreign Affairs Andrzej Lechowski, leading political scientist Radosław Markowski, leading social psychologist Janusz Czapiński, ex-Deputy President of Polish Academy of Science Mirosława Marody, and so on and so on. Many recognized academics. And yes, we can. Different liberal democratic project is possible. It may work. It may be economically effective, socially just, and politically sustainable. With contemporary knowledge of social sciences, I'm saying it here in Harvard, with conscience where I am, from economics and law to pedagogy and psychology, we know how to do it. There isn't the knowledge. We published our project with assistance of National Chamber of Commerce. We had a pretty good public debate, engaging liberal democratic political leaders and intellectuals. Then peace won the election, and liberal democrats turned to hopeless self-defense. What we need now, I believe, is a little bit of determined need of liberal democrats to make positive change. And understanding that we have to defend everlasting idea, not outdated institutions. Idea may be saved, and I believe we know how to do it. Its current institutional shape may not be saved, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Professor Sadurski.
Thank you very much. And first of all, my deep thanks to Professor Eckert and his team here for inviting me and for making this visit possible. I'm grateful all the more so since I'm a commentator on Mr. Jacek Żakowski, Jacek to me, whom I have admired for so many years and who definitely is one of the most brilliant and interesting Polish public intellectuals. I have some troubles in being an effective commentator because I agree with much of what he said. And of course, it's not a great match to have two persons sharing their views, one of them being a commentator. So I will deliberately sharpen my disagreement with Jacek and perhaps act quite self-consciously as a devil's advocate. Who is the devil, you ask? Well, just as Jacek said, this boring liberal Democrat who dreams of going back to the status quo, who is perhaps pathetically anachronistic, my words, not Jacek's, who dreams about restoring the status quo, which can do no better things than bring with it the precisely the sort of populism which now contaminates Polish and not only Polish politics. I should say that I haven't seen Jacek's text before coming here, so I may be a little bit chaotic, but I should say and sort of advertise to you that Jacek at the beginning, in addition to a great number of his extremely important and sort of landmark, I would say, articles. In the beginning of this year, Jacek published a real manifesto in Polityka Weekly. And in that manifesto, Jacek bettered Karl Marx. Karl Marx, as you know, published 11 theses on Feuerbach. Jacek's article consists of 2 sets of 11 theses each. So it's like twice as good as Marx's. And I must say it's much better, actually, because everyone, when one thinks about 11 theses of Feuerbach, I bet that almost everyone knows only the 11th thesis, and all the others are really totally insignificant. While in Jacek's reflections, they are all equally important. So what I want to, in this role of being devil's advocate, I would like to mention 3 issues which arose both of the paper to which I just referred, but especially in Jacek's oral presentation. So the first is about explanation what has happened, the second is about account, what is going on, and the third is about the prospects and especially therapy, what can be done about it. Now, when it comes to explanation, and again, I will be deliberately polemical just to sharpen my views to perhaps stimulate the discussion. But I think that there are some thoughts and some themes in Jacek's ideas which are very present among a number of outstanding members of Polish liberal democratic intelligentsia, which is this very strong attitude of self-blame, leading almost to self-flagellation. And I believe that this self-flagellation of Polish liberal democrats in the face of this disastrous populism which reigns in Warsaw now is probably as faulty and as dangerous as the opposite attitude, this attitude of self-righteousness, the attitude of licking one's wounds in public, the attitude of certain complacency. We have done nothing wrong, and look how harmed we are. I think there must be a space between, on the one hand, self-flagellation, which I believe is not only false, but also dangerous because it may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So between self-flagellation and self-righteousness. And this space in between may have a form of saying we don't have too much of a liberal democracy, but too little of it. And much of the current disaster that today's Poland is an outcome of this incomplete, inconsistent, not full liberal democracy where both adjective and noun are equally important. Okay? And I think Jacek gave a very good example here about this, although it's already an exposed example of this opportunistic and uncertain attitude of Polish liberal parties, like Civic Platform, towards this dreadful Holocaust law, where rather than from the very beginning saying this is fundamentally wrong because it is fundamentally inconsistent with freedom of speech and academic freedoms, and we as liberals are in favor of those very values, they started getting upset only when there have been disastrous international implications of the fact. So that sort of like exposed suggests in what ways Polish so-called Third Republic, the years between 2007 and 2015, were the case of unfinished liberal democratic experiment. And one of another themes, in addition to the questions of freedom of speech and freedom and academic freedom, is of course a totally incomplete Polish secularism. Polish is a secular state in the constitution, but almost theological state when it comes to the practice. And much of the blame should be put on those liberal democrats, but not in the way that populists help us see the truth, but rather that we, if I may use the first plural here, were unfaithful to our true ideals. And now that I've mentioned populists, part of this attitude of self-flagellation is something that I would call, quote unquote, a signaling theory or signaling conception of populism. This is a popular view in contemporary literature on populism. And this literature, as you all know, is enormous. And the books of the sort, How Democracies Die and People versus Democracy and many of which originate from this university and this faculty, ponder over, the issues of what we liberal Democrats, what sense we can make of populism. And one particular idea is that even if populists produce wrong solutions, nevertheless, their successes or their near successes are an important signals. They know something that we didn't know. And I would say, how about if it's incorrect? How about if they are dead wrong about everything that they say? Why should we believe that the very fact that they have nearly won, as in the Netherlands or France, or they have actually won, as in the United States, Poland, and Hungary, how about that it doesn't mean anything about whether they are correct or incorrect? Not only are they incorrect, they are also very evil on a number of issues, such as the question of refugees, asylum seekers, etc. So I would like us at least to consider this view that we shouldn't give too much credit to populists in a way in which many of those self-flagellating liberal democratic intellectuals do. Now, how to explain then their ascent to power? There is a well-known taxonomy or distinction in political science between structural and agentic, that's an ugly word, agency-based theories. One of which emphasizes certain structural objective reasons for political development, others the strength of leadership, so to speak, and agency. One is more a demand-based theory, another more supply-based theory. And we know that probably in order to give a good account of political developments in any state, we must have both. But the different proportions matter. Now, before Poland and Hungary went the way they did, nothing actually could have predicted that these countries, arguably the leaders of post-communist transformations, would go this way. There was an important article years ago by your colleague, Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way in Journal of Democracy, which sort of summarized a little bit their book on competitive authoritarianism. Let me just quote one very short passage where they try to identify in a very laconic and, I think, clear way the main conditions for weakness of democracy, where democracies are fragile, unlikely to occur, likely to fall, not resilient enough, etc. So they say, according to a substantial body of research, stable democratization is unlikely in very poor countries with weak states, dynastic monarchies with oil and Western support, and single-party regimes with strong states and high growth rates. Our own research, Levitsky and Way continue, suggests that democratization is less likely in countries with very low linkage to the West and in regimes born of violent revolutions. That's it. And they give examples of all these instances of these categories in this taxonomy. Now, Poland and Hungary doesn't fit any of these categories. If anything, it is as far from any of these categories as we may imagine, which of course may be one hypothesis may be about sort of perplexity and myopia of political science, but another is that there are very strong limits to these structural theories. That in some countries, in some times, in some moments, extremely strong, determined, committed anti-democratic leaders may seduce the society with their shining packages of several inchoate ideas which sort of roughly, but only roughly, resonate with what with certain anxieties and concerns that people have and win the elections. So that's what, in my view, Kaczynski did. He provided a shiny package in which there was a very strong anti-elite view, he, member of the elite himself, against migrants in a country which basically has no migrants at all, and with a degree of cultural paranoia about modernism, etc. And somehow he managed to win the election. But if that is the lesson which we may draw from what happened in Poland, and perhaps in Hungary, but here we are talking about Poland only, then I think that also suggests some reasons for optimism. Because if really the causes, the explanation of this populist backsliding in countries like Poland are mainly about the agency rather than structure, about the force of leaders rather than objective determinants, then equally similarly, the agency of counter-leaders, of challengers, may prevail over the incumbents. Of course, assuming, and that's a very, very big if, that the incumbents will not so distort the electoral system that there will be no longer a level playing field and that the challengers will basically have no chances of winning. And so that leads me to the last point. So what chances are? What can we do about it? Now, in the last section of his of his paper, Jacek drew this very exhilarating and, I would say, attractive idea of new social movements. The problem is that still it is very difficult to imagine effective democracy with only social movements which clearly do not translate into traditional political parties. Schatzschneider said there is no democracy without parties. Adam Przeworski, whom, by the way, Jacek interviewed a few weeks ago in a fascinating, intriguing interview in Politica, says democracy means a system in which political parties lose election. So we need to have elections, but also we need to have political parties. And all these movements that Jacek is very much excited about, and I'm also sort of excited about, maybe less than Jacek, but I can see great attractiveness in them. In Poland, they failed to translate into a political action of political parties. There is no, if you like, what's the word, segue, there is no follow-up. So yes, there are all sorts of very important, very impressive movements, but they are single-issue movements, one-off movements, episodic movements, and they disappear as quickly as they emerge. Somehow there is no bridge between them and political parties, and without that, probably any sustained action to depose populists is unthinkable. But there is just one other point. And just as I said that the populists, we shouldn't give too much credit to populists, that also means that populists in power, I very deeply believe so, or at least hope so, carry in themselves germs of self-destruction. They are, by their definition, inefficient and ineffective. The leaders, value people who are loyal to them rather than those who are competent. So there is this incompetence written into their DNA, and that I hope means that they will not last too long. So think about it. We are discussing this issue in a country in which a leading newspaper, and I have in mind today's editorial in New York Times, says that a porn star has more credibility and class than the president. I rest my case.
Thank you very much. Redaktor Żakowski, would you like to respond to some of the points Wojtek made?
Well, I don't want to take much time now. So I would perhaps only say I'm not against parties. But I think parties, it's sad to say, are unable to make good choices when they are in power. something changed and in this dimension. So I think parties are probably necessary. I cannot imagine democracy without parties, totally, for legitimization. But as far as process of decision taking is concerned, we must to export it out of parliament, because nothing good comes out of it. That's difficult, but we have these tools, these democratic innovations. It worked very well in Poland, in the different cities like Lublin, like Poznań, like Rzeszów, Gdańsk. They experiment with that. It seems that society is ready to accept this kind of decision-taking process. And I admire what Radosław Markowski prepared for our report. And I think it can be one of promises that this low, untrusted group of politicians will no more make decisions in our name. Then they will just provide general structure for decision taking by society. If we have this kind of narrative, then I hope people will see a new promise, which is necessary to activate them, not constantly, because I don't think that these 30 or 40 or 20 years old people are ready to go to party meetings and spend all days. No, it's rather impossible. But if we will offer a democratic frame in which people can engage as they like, as they are, I mean, not permanently, but to engage when they want. When they want to be a member, when somebody wants to be a member of a deliberative panel, taking decision about how many trees should be there in Warsaw, or should we join European Union or Asiatic Union? Yes, perhaps. Some people are interested, they would apply. We can create a decision-making group, a decision panel, and I think it would be more clever and more acceptable for the society than any decision that Parliament is able, or the government, whichever government. That's why, one. So I think we need this new vision of activization. And the other problem, from my point of view, is these movements. Are movements an answer? I would say it happens they are. And every movement which appeared in Poland in the last 2 years left something. And it's, if we have 30,000 people movement on Krakowskie Przedmieście, defending constitution in front of presidential palace, then people go back home. And 20 people stay. This is Akcja Demokracja. And they create a network. And there is 250,000 people in the network. This is only Facebook. Nothing more. But when they call people, like in last Friday, then 55,000 comes. So it's not the truth that movements disappear totally, because after every demonstration, something stays with us. And I try to, because I'm very fond of it, I try to count. We have like 20 new organizations with 50, 60 new leaders. Each of these leaders is more suitable for public position than vast majority of members of parliament. These are really new people. I mean, we have new political elites already. It's only 2 years. And if peace will stay in power for 10 years, we will have, of course, no, they will not. I'm joking, I promise. But you see, this is the process. I think we must be open to new processes. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, let me open the floor. When you ask the question, please mention your name. Peter Hall. I mentioned your name.
My name is Peter Hall. I teach in the government department. I had two related questions. Thank you, by the way, for a very stimulating, very elegant, and very thought-provoking talk. First, I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on the sources of the fear. I agree with you that populism reflects a politics of fear. I think that's a powerful observation. I'm a little more skeptical about whether the pace of social change is the source of those fears, because the world has changed rapidly in past years, and even without smartphones, it's not clear to me that it's the pace of social change per se that generates the fear. So I wonder if you could say a little more about, in the Polish case in particular, the sources of fear. And then the second question, which is related to that, is when you talk, although this is my term rather than yours, you talk in some ways about the exhaustion of liberal Democrats or liberal democracy in Poland, their incapacity, the incapacity of the institutions, the liberal democratic institutions, to respond to these challenges. I wonder whether what's at stake and what's at the heart of that are liberal democratic institutions, or the kind of neoliberal policies that have gone hand in hand with those institutions, especially in East Central Europe, although certainly not exclusively there. In other words, does the solution really have to lie in changing liberal democratic institutions, or can it lie in changing the neoliberal policies that those institutions have promoted? And my impression, I'm not an expert on East Central Europe, but my impression is that those two things have tended to go together there, but of course they don't necessarily historically. I think Franklin Roosevelt, for instance, managed to change policies in this country dramatically in the face of another crisis without changing the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hall. It's not so easy to answer your questions because I prepare interview with you. So if I will answer it may shape. Sources of fear. I would say the change, instability. Nothing special. I mean, of course, there is a problem of unemployment, for example. And we had a long period of high unemployment, and very many people were afraid that they will lose job. It's not the case anymore, and I think if peace will lose, one of main reasons will be that the level of fears is much lower than, and they support lowering the level of fear, and they will die of that, of their achievements. But that's one. But also rhetorics. You know, civic platform was adopted very limited reforms, economic reforms, and so on and so on. So people were not alarmed with what they did, but people were alarmed with what they were talking about. They were all the time talking about commercialization of medical assistance. And it was constant. So what society felt was that somebody is going to take it back, will have to pay. And there were many projects, ideas, how to do it, how much should we pay, 5 zlotys or 500 zlotys everybody. And it created these emotions. And finally, there was, the constant policy was deregulation. Regulation, we know, is not very good for economy. But it was an obsession. Deregulation of employment law, for example. We are the leader of European Union of self-employment, so-called self-employment, but these are cleaners and waiters and, not artists. And it creates fears, yes, because you never know whether you will pay your checks or not. So this is, I think, it's neoliberalism, but not in what they did, but in what people expected. And institutions and policies. I think that it comes together. If institutions are so much, let's take Polish parliament. If it's so heavily influenced by different groups, I don't mean corruption, but popular talk is, why leader of post-communists in Poland, Leszek Miller, supported flat tax idea at a low level. It's anti-socialistic, yes? Progressive tax, which is good for socialists. Why? Because a group of business people offered him money for election. And if you look at politics in countries like Poland, not only Poland, I know, politicians all the times pay debts when they are in power. Peace pays debts to the church. Liberals pay to business. Is there a place for clever politics? Less and less. So political decisions are as political system is led to politicians. They are constantly under this kind of local pressures. You have this problem in the USA, which is famous all over the world, of course. But we have this problem as well, and Polish democracy is not so deeply rooted in institutions, in culture, in tradition as here. So every problem which makes some difficulties here kills democracies, young democracies like in Poland. That's my explanation.
Yes, please.
Jane Mansbridge, I teach at the Kennedy School. I'd like to follow up on Peter's question and be perhaps more specific. We haven't talked about the decline almost universally in manufacturing jobs and also in small agriculture, so that across Europe and the United States, we see a set of people who had more secure jobs than they do now. And some of them have no jobs, as you say. So naturally, I agree with you. The Cleopatra's Nose theory of history, that there are these long-term trends, but what happens in those long-term trends is often an accident of history. Nevertheless, we do see these populist parties coming up all over the place, and they often appeal to working-class people, and often partly because of the insecurity. But the insecurity isn't caused, I don't believe, just by smartphones. I think it's also caused by the loss of shipbuilding jobs, other union jobs. And I'm wondering, I completely agree with you about the new institutions. That's wonderful. Let's think very creatively about new democratic institutions. But as we think about this new institutions, perhaps we should also be thinking about this underlying problem, which I hadn't noted, I hadn't heard discussed. So I wonder if you could talk about that as a possible cause of this fear.
Well, sure it is, I believe. And the problem is, there are some objective processes, yes? Globalization and smartphones, yes, they appeared, they are here. And there are some subjective points as well. And what I think that this transition concerning agriculture, productive works and so on, this is painful. And if you want to preserve democracy, you must demonstrate. You must demonstrate care, that you care. Sometimes it's more important than what you do. But if you lose people, if you stay them behind, in Poland, Poland is very selfish. Polish culture is very selfish. Pomożesz mi tłumaczyć?
Yes.
There's a famous American saying, "Nobody's left behind." Yes, this concerns American army in action. Yes, and the oldest Polish military song says, jak to na wojence ładnie, kiedy ułan z konia spadnie, koledzy go nie żałują, jeszcze końmi go stratują. That's the difference.
Grzegorz, ty może. What a beautiful thing the battle is, especially when
when a soldier falls down from his horse.
Of the horse, not only his colleagues do not regret his fate, in addition they stamp on him, something like jump on him,
yes.
Something like that.
Yes.
So, what a great literary translation.
So you see the difference. In society, when the saying is nobody left behind, it's much easier to build democracy because there are some relations, obligations to others. When you make your horse to stand on your colleague when he fell down in action, it's different culture. And it's extremely difficult to build, to create a democratic society on this cultural ground. And we experienced it on the beginning of transition. When we just left people in rural areas where state-owned farms were just collapsed. There were 800,000 people left behind. Absolutely nobody wanted to talk about them. So that's the problem. Everybody is expecting that they will leave him behind. That's why when Kaczynski comes and says, I will not leave you behind. That's the crucial point.
Wojtek, would you like to add something on this? Please.
Hi. Thank you very much to both our speaker and our discussant. My name is Ayşe Kadıoğlu. I'm a visiting scholar here at Center for European Studies. I'm studying political opposition. In the footsteps of our discussant, I don't find it surprising that, you would be self-critical, when talking about the opposition liberal, because that's what liberal Democrats do. They are self-critical, and that's a good thing. They know how to disagree, unlike their opponents who do not disagree, who are unified, right, who are not self-critical. But these aren't necessarily strengths. They may be strengths in the short run, but I don't think they are strengths in the long run. But the more important thing here is, again, what was raised by our discussant is this element of agency. You could be self-critical, but that doesn't have to translate into loss of agency. The two are different things. Because when you lose that, it's almost like resigning from being in the position of opposition. Kind of saying like, I don't want to play this game anymore because this is like a really weird game, right? I mean, look at this, it doesn't even deserve my attention. I'm disgusted by it. I can't even look at it kind of thing, right? Self-critical is good, but loss of agency is the problem. And you actually only die when you lose agency, as they say. As human beings, you only die when you lose that. When we look at the Polish opposition, say civic platform, can we say, they initiate politics, or are they just responders, to what, the incumbent government does? Because that's what the institutions are there for, right? Opposition can initiate politics. Opposition can actually work really hard, So I wonder if, you see that resignation in opposition parties, or do you see any little signs of life in there?
No, they are brave. But the problem is, yes, they are defensive and responsive. And the major message is it was not that bad, and current government is extremely bad at whatever they do is wrong. Of course, I suppose most of non-democratic regimes lose power only as a result of internal crisis within the regime. It's very difficult to destroy it, but you can put it under pressures, and these pressures make it more possible that there will be a problem inside. And this opposition tries to do. And I think it's pretty successful. They expose weaknesses, mistakes, and so on. But the problem is, if the government will collapse, if Kaczynski will lose power, then what? Then what? Will we have, like Schetyna said once, the leader of Civic Platform, he said once, we will prepare one bill which will re-establish situation from 2015. How? Is it what the society likes? Is it what people are waiting for? Re-establish? Why don't we re-establish the First Republic? It was pretty good. Or the second one. So the problem is it's never a way back that we know. And we don't know where to go. And for me, Thomas Kuhn is absolutely fantastic explanation. Yes, we don't have a new paradigm to put in the place of the old one. And that's why it was about. And as long as we don't have new paradigm, as we cannot offer it, majority will stick to the old one. And this will to come back. It's like it's a psychoanalytical problem. Yes, coming back to your mother, the preborn. Yes, that's what we like. No, and I don't think this is the solution.
Mr. Elliott. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Mark Elliott, I teach the history of China in the history department in East Asian languages here. And I was thinking, this is not my question, but I was thinking about the Asiatic Union, I think that you were referring to. And I just want to say for the record that having spent a lot of time living and studying in Asia, I don't see a place for Poland in the Asiatic Union. I could be wrong about that.
Knows it. Kaczynski knows
sorry?
it. Kaczynski knows it.
Does he know that? Well,
put this.
That's a good question.
Pass this message to him.
So what I wanted to ask you about has to do with, I think, something that's a problem that's well known here and best known to my colleagues in the government department in the Kennedy School, which is that the principal strength of an open society, of liberal society, is that it's open, and its openness is at the same time its greatest vulnerability. And people have been exploiting that in various ways, off and on, for a very long time. We've seen in the latest US general election new ways in which that vulnerability can be used to severely weaken the institution upon which we presume our democracy and democratic processes are legitimated, namely elections. And I wondered, in a reimagined liberal order of the sort that you're advocating for, which I certainly I would endorse that idea, rather than trying to reinvent the past, which the Chinese are constantly trying to do. How you see institutions, what kinds of institutions can be put in place to keep the electoral process? Again, we fetishize that, but as we all know, elections are easy to game. And we've seen demonstrated very clearly just how easy they are to game. How, if social media is not, and the changes that that's brought is not unprecedented, as Professor Hall was saying, is that aspect, though, of what social media enables, in fact, not something that requires a different level or a different type of response? Thank you.
Well, perhaps too difficult question for me. We can only, I mean, it's much easier in country like the US, with long history of democracy, with institutions and democratic culture. I know you are skeptical about and so on. It's not enough, but still it's 200 years. And so for this kind of democracy, it's much easier to be opened. Because even if you elect Trump, then you have courts, you have establishment, You have huge media and huge money for democracy and so on.
And federalism, which restricts...
And federalism,
the
yes.
presidency.
But I mean, the cultural capital, it's not the case like in a country like Poland. I just mentioned one paranoid factor. You know, Russians interfere in American elections. You know, Russians interfere in French elections. You know, Russians interfere in German elections. You know, Russians interfere in Brexit referendum. We don't know. They interfered in Polish election. Are they not interested? Listen, this is phenomenon. I mean, we have one of biggest counterintelligence service in Europe. We know nothing about Russians in Poland. So, openness, and my guess is they were important in these elections. And we can speculate about that and so on. But we do know nothing about this. This is the difference. That if, but we have some informations. There are some journalists who try to learn, but not strong enough. Not as strong as New York Times, for example. And so I would say openness has different prices in different countries. But if you survive first 150 years or so, then it's easy. Our hope was, we knew that from the very beginning. Yes, that beginning, the beginning is very difficult. But we expected that, I don't want to be very selfish, but we expected that we will gain more support from all democracies. More support, I mean, like in this situation in counterintelligence, for example. We expected a kind of umbrella. And it was, I think it actually was very long. But something happened. And probably everybody started to believe, in Poland and abroad, that we grown up. And the feeling of growing up is extremely important also in race of Polish populism. Because the society came to the conclusion, quarter of a century passed, we do well, why they still teach us? We will teach them now. We will show them how to make democracy, and we show you how to make democracy. We are very effective, of course. We are leaders. And one more thing, it didn't happen in 2015. If you look at institutional changes in last 10 years, step by step, democratic institutions were limited within the parliament, in Sejm, new regulations, every 2 years, limiting rights of single representatives and exceeding rights of marszałek, speaker of the Sejm. The same in relations between city presidents and city boards. All the time towards presidentialism. And this kind of presidentialism very well fits to authoritarian tradition of 20s and 30s in Poland, of the Second Republic. And the cult, I mean, this is also, if you ask Hungary and Poland. Poland is the only European country where main places in cities Also in Warsaw, the main square in Warsaw is named with the name of Piłsudski, who was Polish dictator for 15 years or so, yes, or more, and died as dictator after coup d'etat. Is there any other country in Europe where monuments of ex-dictator are still constructed? Is there any? Is there any country in Europe where a dictator, the name of dictator, is given to squares, streets, schools, and so on? No such a place. That means that this authoritarian fascination is still present in the culture. And if you look at Hungary, this tradition is perhaps not as exposed, but it also haven't been overcome, because under communism, everything that was before was good, of course. So the cult of Horthy, the cult of Piłsudski, rested there. I mean, that's why it's so easy to re-establish authoritarian, in my opinion, authoritarian government in Poland, because those cultural liberal Democrats, like Kaczyński, like Tusk, like Kwaśniewski, and so on, they were always, every year, paying tribute to Piłsudski. Is there any other place like this in Europe?
But if I may say so, I believe, while I would agree about assessment of Piłsudski as a dictator who carried out successful coup d'etat, as far as the diagnosis of Polish collective memory is concerned, he's not remembered and cherished and applauded because he did a coup d'etat, but because he is considered to be the father of Polish independence. And he is really cherished in that capacity. So one may, of course, say there is a puzzle. How can you draw the line in one person between two types of memories? But I think it's the memory related to 1980 and then 1920 war, not to 1926.
But look, Piłsudski yes, Pétain not. It says something about the culture. Why? Yes, because the dictatorship is not as bad to make not important his role in 1920. I think that's the problem. That it was awful dictatorship, awful. Yes, with crazy dictator shooting to his officers when he got crazy. Yes, but Poles like it. Poles like it. In the Polish TV, like a few days ago, a host of a show, entertainment, says, I remember the fantastic officer of Piłsudski who ride on a back of a horse to the most popular restaurant in Warsaw to let the horse drink water from the fountain within the restaurant. Imagine now, General Powell on his horse entering the best restaurant in Washington. Imaginable? Or Graś. You know Graś? Somebody of you know who is Graś. And Poles like it. And it's very positive in the culture, the memory of these crazy officers in the Polish junta in 20s and 30s.
I want to notice that we move from institutions to culture in the end. I'm afraid that we are out of time. My apology to Bojan and others who wanted to ask the question. So thank you so much for attending Zaleski lecture, and you are all invited upstairs to the reception to continue the discussion. And join me to thank Jacek Żakowski and Wojciech Sadurski.